So most of you know I have 3 kids, 2 of them relatively young. Nora's 10, Ryder's not yet 6, Lucy's 4. So most of my life, and those of you who have raised kids, you know this, most of my life is spent dressing other humans and making them go places they don't want to go, right? Because in many ways, that's the definition of childhood, or at least it's one way to think about childhood. Childhood is that season of your life where other people dress you and make you go places that you otherwise wouldn't go, right? Adulthood, by contrast, most of us dress ourselves, and even though we tell ourselves that this is not true, we have the freedom to go where we want. This is the 3rd week in the season of Easter. Now, that language may be unfamiliar to some of you. We're used to thinking about Easter as a day. Easter is a day. It's the day that we celebrate the death or the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. But the day of Easter starts a season that we call Easter. It's 7 weeks. It goes from Easter Day to the day of Pentecost, which we'll talk about in about a month from now. So in the season of Easter, what we're doing is we're exploring the ramifications or the implications of the resurrection. We celebrate the resurrection on Easter, and then we basically, for 7 weeks, we ask, so what? What does it matter that Jesus died on a cross and rose from the dead? What difference does that make in our actual daily lives? Stanley Hauerwas is a renowned theologian. He's a professor at Duke Divinity School. And he said once that the Christian person doesn't explain the resurrection explains the Christian. Meaning that there ought to be some things true if you're a follower of Jesus Christ. If you're not a follower of Jesus Christ, it doesn't pertain to you. But if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, there ought to be some things about your life that would be otherwise inexplicable if not for the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. One of those things ought to be an inversion of this childhood, adulthood experience. Where childhood, we are dressed and we have to go places we don't want, and adulthood, we get to dress ourselves and go where we do want. Because Jesus rose from the dead, for those who follow him, the opposite is true. So I want you to hear an exchange that the risen Jesus has with one of his closest disciples, one of his closest friends, a man named Peter. So this is post-resurrection. Jesus meets with Peter, and this is what he says to him. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself, and you went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. All right, so this is the exact opposite of our experience. When you're young, people dress you and they take you where you don't want to go. And when you're old, you dress yourself and you have the freedom to do what you want. For followers of Jesus Christ, the opposite is the case. Youth, childhood, immaturity is characterized by the kind of freedom that we normally associate with our adulthood. We come and go as we please. We do whatever we want to do. We dress ourselves. Jesus would call that childhood. He would define that as immaturity. Whereas the mature person, the mature follower of Christ, the adult, is the person whose life is characterized by now a lack of that kind of freedom. And I put freedom in quotes because biblically speaking, that's not freedom at all. Freedom's not the ability to do what you want, biblically speaking. That's libertarian freedom. That's how we understand it. We're going to talk a lot about this summer. We understand freedom as this sort of libertarian ability to do whatever we want. Biblically speaking, God-given freedom is the capacity to do as you should. It's a very different construct. So for the person who follows Jesus, adulthood is defined not by this sort of libertarian freedom to do whatever you want, but a voluntary willingness to be led. Specifically led to places you otherwise wouldn't go. Places that someone who's not following a risen Lord would not go. But you will go there, And then if someone asked you, well, what are you doing that for? The only way you'd be able to explain it would be to say, because my risen Lord told me to. And so I don't really have a choice. This is what Jesus envisioned. Right? What Jesus envisions is what I'll call a divine human partnership. A divine human partnership in recreating the world. I mean, it's why he called these disciples in the first place. You know, when he called the disciples, it was into this vision of partnering together to make a new world, a new reality. Just before this exchange that Jesus has with Peter, you find the disciples fishing. Many of them were fishermen. That's how they made a living. Jesus has died. He's risen from the dead. They've seen him a couple times at this point, at least in John's story. But either because, they thought that, they hadn't seen Jesus in a few days. Maybe they thought, okay, he's gone for good, or they were just killing time. Who knows? They go fishing. And they fish all night, and they don't catch anything. And at dawn, early in the morning, obviously they're probably frustrated, ready to call it quits. And a man standing on shore calls out to them and says, hey, have you caught anything? And they say no. And he says, well, throw your nets out again. Why don't you try one more time? And when they do, they catch so many fish that they can't pull the nets into the boat. The nets are too heavy. And the story says that in that moment, one of the disciples, John, realized that the guy on shore was the risen Jesus. And so he says, oh my gosh, it's Jesus. And as soon as Peter hears that, he throws his coat on, abandons ship, he dives into the water, swims to shore. And when he gets to the beach, he finds Jesus there making breakfast. Jesus has got a fire going, and Peter walks up, and Jesus offers him bread and fish for breakfast. Now, if you know the Jesus story, and you know the story of the disciples, both of those stories should sound familiar to you. So when you read this story of the disciples hauling in this big net of fish, and then you hear bread and fish at breakfast, you should, wait a minute, we've been here before. These stories are echoes from their past. The reason that John puts these stories toward the end of his gospel is to make a connection. To make a connection between post-resurrection life and what Jesus talked about when he was in his ministry. What was Jesus trying to do? Both of these stories share the common theme of participation. So the first time that the disciples experienced the miraculous catch of fish, it was right after Jesus met most of them. Almost identical scenario. They're out all night, they're fishing, they don't catch anything, they're frustrated, and Jesus says, hey, why don't you try again? And they say, okay, fine, since you're telling us, we'll try. And they catch so many fish that their nets begin to break. And when that scene is over, what Jesus says to them is, from now on, you're not going to catch fish, you're going to fish for people. The last time that you saw bread and fish at a meal, Jesus took some loaves and some fishes, and he miraculously multiplied them to feed thousands of people. But he gave the baskets of bread and fish to the disciples to distribute. And they were the ones who walked away with basketfuls of leftovers when the incident was over. See, in both the miraculous catch of fish story and the feeding of the 5,000, the common theme is participation. Jesus performs this creative, life-giving miracle. And the disciples get to participate in it. In a sense, they do it together. And you even see that in this echo story in John 21. When Peter gets to shore and sees Jesus having breakfast, one of the things Jesus says is, hey, why don't you go get some of the fish you caught and bring them? Put them on the fire. He's already got fish there. He's already cooking fish. He said, why don't you go get some of the fish you caught and bring them? Add your fish to my fish and we'll have breakfast together. Right? There's this participation that Jesus envisions. That what we get to be a part of, what post-resurrection life is all about, is partnering with God in this miraculous giving of new life to the world through Christ. That's the good news that we call the Christian gospel. Right? If you weren't here for Easter, what my Easter message essentially is that if you want to understand resurrection, if you want to understand Easter, you have to understand the story that Easter's located in. This whole story of God. And it's a story that's bookended. Beginning and end, it's bookended. On the front end by an act of creation. In Genesis 1 and 2, there's an act of creation. First two books of the Bible, chapters of the Bible. In the last two chapters of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22, it's an act of recreation or new creation. The story of God is bookended by creation and new creation. That's the story. In most popular Christian circles, you would think that the story of God doesn't run from Genesis 1:2 to Revelation 21:22. It runs from Genesis 3 to Revelation 20. See, that's the story of sin and judgment. And in most pop Christian circles, that's the story that people hear. That human beings are sinners, and then eventually there's going to be a day of judgment. That's a truncated story. That's not the good news that we call the Christian gospel. In fact, an author named Andy Crouch says it's not good news at all. Because it's not good, and it's not news. You can't have a story that starts with sin and ends in judgment, literally starts bad and ends bad, and somehow say it's good. Not to mention, it's not really revelatory. You go out into the world as a Christian person and tell people that, hey, human beings are sinners and that someday there's going to be a judgment. You don't need to be a Christian to know that. Any human being, regardless of their faith persuasion, can look out the window or turn on the news and realize that something's not right with the world. They may not call it sin. You can call it whatever you want to call it. G.K. Chesterton is a British theologian, author. One time he said, sin is the only empirically provable Christian doctrine. He said, sin is a fact as practical as potatoes. Nobody can ignore it. You don't have to call it what the Bible calls it. You can call it whatever you want. But we all know something's not right with the world. And we all know that something's not right with us. I mean, forget about God's standards for a second. You and I, we don't even keep our own standards. You can call that whatever you want to call that. But regardless of a person's faith persuasion, you can look at the world and you can see, something's not right. Something's not right with the world and something's not right with me. Sin's not a mystery. It's a fact as practical as potatoes. And look, and neither is judgment, really. I mean, we all know it comes around. You don't get away with it forever. We all know that. You know that. You teach your kids that. You've experienced that in your life. You cannot just live a reckless, wanton, self-absorbed, pride-driven, bitter, egotistical life and think that you're not going to experience pain and suffering. That pain and suffering is what we would call judgment. Again, you can take God out of it if you want, but there are consequences for the way that we live, personally, collectively, globally. There are consequences for the way that we see ourselves in the world and how we live. We call that judgment. That's not revelation. That's simple cause and effect. So the Christian gospel is not Genesis 3 to Revelation 20. The good news of the Christian story is not sin and judgment. That's not good and it's not news. The unique story that the church tells is the story of creation to new creation. That our story begins not with sin. That's not what's most fundamentally true about you or anybody else. What's most true is a benevolent act of creation. And the story ends not with judgment. Judgment is always the penultimate act, not the ultimate one. The story ends with a benevolent act of new creation or recreation. That's the story that Jesus was always introducing to people. Repent, repent. So the kingdom of God is here. Something different is available. Something new is available. You can walk away from the story of sin and judgment, and you can enter into the story of creation and new creation. You can become participants in that with me. That's what he invited them into. It's what he invites us into. And this echo of miraculous catch of fish and breakfast on the beach, it's a reminder to them. It's literally John connecting post-resurrection reality with Jesus' mission. Don't forget what I taught you about. Don't forget why I came. Don't forget what this is all about. One way to think about how the resurrection explains us is it redefines your vocation. So they were fishermen, many of them. But because Jesus rose from the dead, they weren't just fishermen. They were more than that. They were participants in a new world. They were heralds of good news. Yes, they fished. Man doesn't live on bread alone, but man does live on bread. Okay, you got to go to work. They fished, but they weren't just fishermen. They were partakers of a different kingdom. They had news to share. That became their new way of understanding their place in the world. See, we are all fishermen. Right? We're teachers, we're doctors, we're business people, we're stay-at-home parents. But we're not just that anymore. You see, if the claims of Christianity that Jesus died and rose from the dead, if those claims are false, then you should think Christianity is insane and you should have nothing to do with it. But if they're true, then there's no gray area. If they're true, then the resurrection of Jesus becomes ground. It becomes the foundation that your whole life is anchored into. It is literally the truth that defines everything about who you are. You're not just a teacher, you're not just a doctor, you're not just a business person, you're not just a stay-at-home parent. If Jesus rose from the dead, you are a participant in a new world, a bearer of good news, news of creation and new creation, into a world that only sees sin and judgment. That's our new vocation. It's our new way in the world. And here's how we live it out. This is our new way. That your professed love of God, is inextricably linked to and measured by your actual love of people. So your professed love of God, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. If you're here on a Sunday morning, you're either lost or on some level you're curious about, or you would straight up say, I love God, so I'm here. Because I love lots of things. I love donuts. I could be sitting somewhere eating donuts right now, but I'm choosing to be at church. Why? Because I love God, and I love the family of God, and I want to be together, right? You're here. So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand and say, yes, Mike, I love God. But the way of the Jesus follower in this new world is that your professed love of God is inextricably linked to and measured by your actual love of people. So after they get done having breakfast on the beach, Jesus takes the opportunity to have a little conversation with Peter. This is how that conversation goes. He says, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? I assume by more than these, he means the other disciples. Peter was often making bold claims about his willingness to love and obey Jesus when everybody else would, fail. Do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. You ever said that to somebody? Have you ever looked at somebody and said, you know I love you? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A third time, he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, then feed my sheep. 3 times, Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? It's a profound question. I want you to imagine Jesus asking you that question. Imagine the risen Jesus after teaching and healing people and raising the dead and challenging the powers and principalities, and then dying on a cross while you either abandoned him or participated in it. And then 3 days later, he rises from the dead, proclaims forgiveness over you, announces peace to you, and then makes you breakfast. Do you love him? It's a question that I used to ask when I worked for Young Life. And kids would hear about the cross. It's as easy a question, but as profound and complicated. Hear about the cross, hear about the resurrection, and ask yourself, do you love him? Don't answer too hastily. Because the answer changes everything about who you are. It changes everything. It changes the entire orientation and direction of your life. Because it's not just words. Our professed love of God is linked and measured by something. I've been married almost 15 years. When we got married, I stood up in front of friends and family, and I made vows. I said things like, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, till death do us part, right? I acknowledged and I accepted that my love for my spouse would be measurable by me actually keeping the commitments that I said I would keep. That I couldn't continue to claim to love her if at some point I stopped being faithful to the promises that I declared. I just understood that. And of course that makes sense. And the same is true with your kids. I can't claim to love my kids if I don't feed them and clothe them and play with them on occasion and provide for their future. That would be silly. That would make no sense. God is the one being in the universe that somehow, we have convinced ourselves we can claim to love without our love having to actually be measurable. Jesus says it doesn't work that way. Do you love me? 3 times he asks. 3 times Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. But how does he know that? See, that's what we do. We use our words to fill the gaps when our actions fall short. We think that if we say it enough, the other person will believe it. Lord, you know I love you. You know it. Honey, you know I love you. But you know I love you. But how do I know? He said, I'll tell you how I know. You tell me that you love me, I'll tell you how I know. Feed my sheep. Take care of my lambs. That's how I'll know. Feeding and tending. Care for. See, our professed love of God is inextricably linked to and measured by our love for others. And we know that's what the cross teaches us. It's part of the revelation that sets us free, that what you do to human beings, you are doing to God. You can't accuse and condemn and execute somebody thinking that you're just getting rid of a rabble-rouser, because 3 days later he shows up. See, when you crucify the image of man, you're crucifying the image of God. The flip then is also true. The same guy that recognized that the dude on the beach was Jesus later would write these words. He would say, "You cannot love God whom you do not see if you do not love people who you do see." Your professed love of God is inextricably linked to and measured by your actual love of people. Now, this is where it gets interesting. This is where we thin the herd. You notice, again, you know the Jesus story, you notice the threefold repetition. Jesus asks 3 times, "Do you love me?" Peter says 3 times, "You know I love you." Jesus says 3 times, "Feed my sheep, take care of my lambs." It's an intentional parallel. Right before Jesus was crucified, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. 3 different times, Peter got asked by somebody, "Hey, do you know this guy? Are you with this guy? Are you one of this guy's disciples?" And 3 times Peter said, "No, I don't know this guy. I have no idea. I've never even seen the guy." And the reason that Peter does that is not hard to understand. I mean, haunting for me is I would have done the same thing. Peter's just saving his own life. He knows that if he says, "Yeah, I know him, and I'm his disciple, what are you going to do about it?" He knows he's going to end up on a crucifix right next to him. And he doesn't want that to happen. Now, if you had asked Peter in the same moment, "Do you love Jesus?" He said, yeah. You see? He denies knowing Jesus out of a sense of self-preservation. And that is the same impulse that will keep you from actually loving people as a demonstration of your professed love of God. Because to love people, at some point, it is going to threaten what you perceive to be your life. It's going to threaten your bank accounts. It's going to threaten your free time. It's going to threaten your sense of comfort. It's going to threaten your use of talents and gifts. It's going to threaten your education. It might threaten your career path. And for some people all over the world, it actually threatens their physical lives. If you are going to take your vocation as a follower of Jesus seriously, and it's the only way to take it. It's the only way to take it. If Jesus rose from the dead, it is the ground of reality. There's no gray area. The risen Jesus either dictates your life or it's bunk. So if you're going to take your vocation seriously, and that's the only way to take it, and it's measured by, that your professed love of God is measured by your love of people, at some point, you're going to be called to love someone in some way that is going to threaten what you perceive to be your life. It's going to challenge what you have become conditioned to think that you need or want in order to have the life that you think is your life. It's in those moments that anyone who's not following a risen Jesus is going to say, "I'm out." Because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't earn you anything. It's going to cause nothing but suffering and pain and struggle and discomfort and inconvenience. And so anybody who's not following a risen Lord is going to say, "Hey, if I got the choice here, I'm out." But anybody who believes that Jesus died and rose and loves him for it. Is going to stretch out their hands, and they're going to voluntarily, they're not being coerced, they're going to voluntarily let Jesus lead them to places that they admittedly would not otherwise go. It's in those moments that you may not be able to explain the resurrection. But it's in those moments that the resurrection will explain you. So I want you to think about your own life, reflect on your own life for just a minute, and ask yourself, are you choosing right now, are you choosing to love today someone in some way that only makes sense in light of following the risen Jesus? That you are loving someone, somewhere, in some way, that someone who's not following a risen Jesus, if they found out about it, they would say, why do you do that? And you'd be forced to say, look, I can't explain it to you. It's not going to make sense to you, but my risen Lord told me to do it. It would only make sense because of that. That's the difference that the resurrection makes.